This video will provide my commentary on the short story The Third and Final Continent by Jhumpa Lahiri, which I commonly assign as a reading to students enrolled in my college composition course at Tallahassee Community College. There are a number of reasons I assign this story, and I want to run through a few of them here at the top of this video. First, and I should say that I'm producing this video in January of 2017, there is an ongoing discussion about the role of immigrants in American life. And lately, there's been a lot of negative attention given to immigrants and immigrant communities in the United States. These discussions are ongoing, and I think it's clear to all of us that talk about immigration will be continuing for some time. The Third and Final Continent sheds light on the immigrant experience, illustrates the hardships faced by immigrants, and reminds us that when we talk about these major national issues, we're ultimately talking about the lives of individual people. It does this by focusing on the life of just one person, our protagonist, who immigrates to the United States as a young man, showing us the individual experience of immigration, and hopefully inspiring in us some empathy for his experience. This is one thing that good literature often does. It illustrates big issues, big ideas, and how those issues and ideas affect the real lives of individuals, allowing us to feel their struggles and triumphs, and that empathy is something that I feel we need a lot more of in American society today. A second reason I assign this story is because it illustrates an experience that's universal, and that's the sense of feeling like an outsider. We all feel like outsiders at various points in our lives. Many of us feel very much like outsiders as we start out our college experience, making this story about someone who feels very much like an outsider very pertinent for college freshmen to read. If you're taking this class online, you may not relate to that experience of feeling like an outsider, but I imagine at some point along the way through this experience you probably will. The experience of going through college can be unnerving and unmooring. We inevitably encounter an incredible diversity of people and ideas, and it's hard sometimes to feel at home in an experience that can seem so foreign. The protagonist of The Third and Final Continent perseveres through his experience of feeling like an outsider and ultimately settles into what is for him a satisfying life, marrying, raising a child, and making a good life for himself and his family in his new country. The protagonist's perseverance in the face of obstacles should serve as an inspiration for all of us when we find ourselves in new and unusual circumstances to which we must adjust and endure. Whenever I discuss any text I've assigned, I like to take a moment to talk about the author because I think we can get more from a text by knowing who's speaking to us through it. So what I'll present here are just bits and pieces of information I've cobbled together from various sources, so hopefully everything I say is accurate. Lahiri's parents were both born in India, but Lahiri was born in London, and she came to the U.S. with her parents when she was 2 years old. She grew up in Rhode Island, and her father was a librarian at the University of Rhode Island, so you can start to see where some of the inspiration for this story came from. Lahiri's family did make frequent trips to India, and they spoke Bengali, the family's heritage language and the language of our protagonist, at home when Lahiri was growing up. She earned her bachelor's degree from Barnard College and her master's and PhD degrees from Boston University, both very highly regarded institutions, I might add. And Lahiri did admit in an interview I saw someplace that The Third and Final Continent is autobiographical, but I guess that's pretty obvious judging from biography. Jhumpa Lahiri is the author of 5 books up to now. Interpreter of Maladies and Unaccustomed Earth are collections of short stories. Incidentally, The Third and Final Continent appears in Interpreter of Maladies. The Namesake and The Lowland are both novels, and The Namesake, by the way, was made into a beautiful feature film starring Kal Penn. And Jhumpa Lahiri's most recent work is In Other Words, a nonfiction book about her experience living in Rome and making a serious study of the Italian language. It's always good to give credit where credit is due, so I'll mention that Jhumpa Lahiri has won the highest honors that an author can win in the United States and in Britain, and she won the Pulitzer for the collection of short stories that includes The Third and Final Continent. Just one last fun fact about Jhumpa Lahiri is that President Obama has named her as one of his favorite authors. Here's an excerpt from an article in the New York Times with an accompanying photo of President Obama and his daughter out doing some Christmas shopping at a bookstore, where a copy of The Lowland was among his purchases. Now I'll move on to the real crux of my commentary here, and one thing I want to talk about is the genre into which this story pretty squarely fits, which is a genre of American multi-ethnic literature. Jhumpa Lahiri is widely regarded as one of the most prolific and representative authors in the genre of American multi-ethnic literature, so I want to spend just a few minutes talking about that genre in general. Here's my definition of what the genre is. Others may find it reductive, but I think it hits most of the high points. In general, it refers to literature written by authors of mixed cultural and racial backgrounds, including multiracial and second-generation immigrant writers, and/or literature about characters that write about the experience of multicultural and multiracial backgrounds. Themes often center on characters struggling to assimilate into North American culture while retaining aspects of their cultures of origin which they value. Common characteristics of the genre include a focus on stories about mixed race and immigrant Americans. This is a group that has not historically received much attention, and the works of American multi-ethnic literature are interesting just for shedding light on an experience which has been largely in the shadows for many years. Another interesting point about much of American multi-ethnic literature is that we might refer to it as the literature of the outsider. Characters often have the experience of being different, being outside the mainstream, and learning to adapt and find a sense of peace, prosperity, and comfort, sometimes by adapting and integrating, and at other times holding fast to traditions and ideals, often even more so than those who remain embedded in one culture throughout their lives. In this way, stories in the American multi-ethnic literature genre remind us all of our own outsidedness, how we are unique and different. Something else that tends to characterize works of American multi-ethnic literature is a focus on people who at times feel, and at times really are, fairly powerless to control certain aspects of their circumstances. The characters we meet often lack control over many aspects of their lives. They have, at least for a time, limited command of the dominant language. They can't vote. They can't really participate much in society. They lack control. They almost always lack financial resources, and often as not, they're ambivalent about life in the adopted country, having migrated in hopes of giving their children a better life, or even fearing for their safety due to social instability back at home. What I find is that there rarely are happy endings in these stories, nor are there necessarily sad endings. The characters just learn to cope and carry on, and I find that really instructive and really inspiring. The final characteristic of American multi-ethnic literature that I'll mention here is that these works often raise questions about identity. Characters in these stories frequently have to resolve conflicts over who they have been and who they will be in this new culture. They can't avoid being changed. Sometimes they find themselves dispensing with some of the beliefs and cultural practices of their home countries, and sometimes they hold certain beliefs and cultural practices even more closely than they did before. They change and adapt over the course of the story. Now that I've given you some background about the story and the author, I'd like to hone in and do a close reading of a few specific passages from the story that really struck me and that I think are really important to notice. And the first of these is that we see in our protagonist here the kind of person who would not traditionally be the subject of artistic attention. Actually, he's kind of boring. You may have noticed that as you were reading. Here's what I mean. This is what he finds noteworthy to describe about his new life in America. I bought tea bags and a flask, which the salesman at Woolworths referred to as a thermos. A flask, he informed me, was used to store whiskey, another thing I had never consumed. Here's another line about his life in London. On weekends, we lounge barefoot in drawstring pajamas, drinking tea and smoking Rothmans, or set out to watch cricket at Lord's. London is this fascinating global city, but he's not out on the town living the exhilarating life we might expect. He's just this hard-working, dependable, steady, sober kind of guy who works in a library. And in my experience, and I've spent a lot of time teaching English as a second language and becoming close with people who immigrated to the United States, this is the pretty common archetype of an immigrant in the U.S. Nonetheless, I think it can be said that our protagonist leads a fascinating, admirable, and inspiring life living on 3 continents and learning to live across 3 distinct cultures. Another thing I think is important to point out is how this story reflects just the difficulty of the immigrant experience, which I really think you see illustrated well by this line. A few days after receiving the letter, as I was walking to work in the morning, I saw an Indian woman on the other side of Massachusetts Avenue, wearing a sari with its free end nearly dragging on the footpath, and pushing a child in a stroller. An American woman with a small black dog on a leash was walking to one side of her. Suddenly, the dog began barking. From the other side of the path, I watched as the Indian woman, startled, stopped in her path, at which point the dog leapt up and seized the end of the sari between its teeth. The American woman scolded the dog, appeared to apologize, and walked quickly away, leaving the Indian woman to fix her sari in the middle of the footpath and quiet her crying child. Even one's wardrobe choices can have profound consequences in a strange new country. And then there's this line, the significance of which is easy to miss. I was used to it all by then. The cornflakes and milk. used to Helen's visits, used to sitting on the bench with Mrs. Croft. I think the word choice here is interesting. Our protagonist just gets used to things. He doesn't love his new life. He doesn't adore his new home, at least not yet. But his choice to migrate was necessary, and he's getting used to it, and beginning to feel more settled and less unhinged. I also think we should acknowledge the many positive things that happen to the protagonist, including the fact that the experience of being immigrants seems to open a door for the protagonist and his wife Mala to grow much closer, as we see in this excerpt. Together we explored the city and met other Bengalis, some of whom are still friends today. We discovered that a man named Bill sold fresh fish on Prospect Street and that a shop in Harvard Square called Cardullo's sold bay leaves and cloves. I took pictures of her posing in front of the Prudential building so that she could send them to her parents. The last point that I want to make here, and I must say that I've just scratched the surface of all I'd like to say about this remarkable work of literature, is to examine for a moment some of what Jhumpa Lahiri does technically as a writer that I feel is noteworthy. One of the many things that she does well here is to use sensory details to bring her story to life. Every story recounts experience, either real or imagined, transferring it from one person's consciousness to another's. We all experience the world through sensations: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. What skilled writers do is they appeal to the senses in order to recreate experience in the minds of readers. Another way of saying this, and it's something of a mantra in many creative writing classes, is show, don't tell. Good writing, at least good narrative writing, should show the events that happen in a story by describing them in rich detail. And there are a number of very specific things skilled writers do to show the action of a story. One type of sensory detail is the use of active verbs, which show us what the characters in a story do. Lahiri does this first when our protagonist is describing the YMCA where he lived briefly, and he says, "Pigeon feathers drifted onto the windowsill." You know, he could have just said the place was really dirty, but picking out that one detail about the pigeon feathers falling all outside his window really paints the picture for us, telling us that the place was old and not kept up, with wild birds flying all around the place. Later, when the protagonist is describing Mrs. Croft's house, the second place he lived, he similarly communicates a poorly maintained atmosphere by showing us how stray blades of grass poked between the cracks and a tangle of forsythia bushes plastered against the front and sides. And finally, instead of just telling us that Mrs. Croft is really, really old, the protagonist shows us by saying age had battered her features so that she almost resembled a man. Another strategy that writers sometimes use to show a scene, as opposed to just telling about it, is to make strategic use of adjectives, though it's best not to overuse them. Lahiri does this again when describing Mrs. Croft. Her voice was bold and clamorous. And with these two descriptive words, we can almost hear the harsh manner of speaking often employed by the very elderly. A third type of sensory detail is ascribing shapes and colors to the objects within a scene. Again, when our protagonist is describing his time at the YMCA, he says, "To pass the time in the evening, I read the Boston Globe downstairs in a spacious room with stained glass windows." The image I see when I read this is one of those very old, early 20th century buildings with lots of big, wide-open spaces and lots of fine details like the stained glass. One of the more comical lines comes in the initial description of Mrs. Croft. A mass of snowy hair was arranged like a small sack on top of her head. And then we learn that she has shrunken eyes, prominent creases, lips chapped and faded, eyebrows missing. The final type of sensory detail we'll look at is focusing on movement and change, describing the movements of the characters in order to reveal information about them and in order to move the plot forward. Here's a great example. She stared at the letter, then handed it back to me carefully, gripping it with her fingers as if it were a dinner plate heaped with food instead of a sheet of paper. She slapped the space beside her on the bench with one hand and told me to sit down. For a moment she was silent. Then she intoned, as if she alone possessed this knowledge, "There's an American flag on the moon." And that concludes this video commentary on Jhumpa Lahiri's The Third and Final Continent.